so much, Colleen, for joining us. Uh, I have the Herculean and the most honorable and probably a very easy task, as contradictory as the three words sit next to each other, of introducing Dr. Colleen Taylor Sen. I say it is honorable for reasons obvious, and I say it's Herculean and it is easy in the same sentences because Colleen Taylor Sen needs no introduction in this room. Colleen is an author who specializes in Indian cuisine. She has written and co-edited 8 books and many articles, and also has contributed entries to many journals. We all know that I have the fortune. I'm fortunate to know that Colleen is currently working on her next book, and while I invite Colleen Taylor Sen to deliver her keynote address, I would also like her to maybe touch upon and let us know what we are expecting next from her. Over to you, Colleen.
Thank you very much, Tanushree, for that very nice introduction. I want to congratulate you, Om, and Sunkalp for organizing this wonderful program. And I want to congratulate all the people who gave papers and all those people. I'm sorry, can you see me on screen?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, and all those people who won prizes. I think this symposium was just a wonderful idea, and so what I want to talk about. I'm the last speaker, and I know you probably all want to go and have dinner or meet or whatever. So I'm not going to talk a lot, but I wanted to talk about really why meetings like this are so important. I really in so many ways to scholars, to journalists, and especially to people of those of you who are writers and want to publish a book. Because I think while of course you need to have a good command of your subject matter, you need to be an expert, but I think just as important is having some luck. And luck that you can create yourself by attending programs like this one. And I'd like to give a couple of examples just in my own experience over the years. The opportunities that have come to me from attending a symposia like the one you're at today. Around 25 years ago, I went for the first time to the Oxford Symposium of Food and Cookery in the UK, which is probably the world's most prestigious food conference. And I think it was the first one ever held. And it was started by 2 professors at Oxford in 1981, Alan Davidson and Theodore Zelton. And when I went for the first time, which was, I think about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it had really been going on for a while. A friend of mine who told me about it, he couldn't go this time. So I really had to go pretty much by myself. I didn't know anyone. I was kind of nervous. I even submitted my first paper, which was called The Portuguese Influence on Bengali Cuisine. And I must have researched this thing for months. I mean, I was working full time at another job, but, I kept working on this paper. And I still think it's probably one of the best things I've ever written. And certainly it was the most cited of my papers. So that evening, there was no reception. It was I was at loose ends, and I ran into 2 other Americans who were in the same boat. So it turned out, and we went and had dinner, and it turned out they had both begun editing series of books on the cuisines of different countries, and they were really looking for contributors. So at that point, I'd written quite a few articles about Indian food. I'm not a cookbook writer. I don't write cookbooks. I don't do recipes, but I'd written articles on the cultural meaning of different cuisines for local newspapers. I interviewed people I knew. I wrote about Kerala cuisine. I think the Indian government I wrote about a mango festival. So I had some experience writing about Indian food and for newspapers and magazines. So I volunteered to write books for their series. And the first one was Korea Global History, and the other was Food Culture in India. And I'd never written a book before, but I'd gathered a lot of information over the years. So I was really kind of prepared for it. And people always ask me, and that's how I got interested in writing about Indian cuisine. So Actually, the main reason was I was kind of unemployed at one point, and my husband said, "Well, why don't you do some freelance writing?" Now, his mother, Arati Sen, she in her day, she was a pretty well-known writer. She wrote in Bengali and English, and she had her own magazine. She wrote for Illustrated Weekly, and she had a column in Dish, which I think at one point was the one of the most widely read columns in India. I I told this story to a class at a culinary school. One of the students asked me what inspired me to get writing, and when I said my mother-in-law, and later the principal of the school said to me, "You must be one of the first people who has had very nice things to say about her mother-in-law in India." But I never really knew her very much. She died fairly young, but she really, in a sense, was an inspiration because that's really how got the idea of really writing this kind of thing. Now, at this very same Oxford Symposium, I met someone who became a good friend and also collaborator, who was Helen Saberi. And her husband was from Afghanistan. We both were married to men from South Asia. And she'd written an acclaimed book on Afghan food and also wrote other papers about the food of the subcontinent. And she later became Ellen Davidson's assistant on the Oxford Companion of Food. And again, this was kind of a first. It was an encyclopedia of food with different kinds of entries about dishes, about countries, about people. So, and that really led to the creation of many others of this sort of thing. So a few years later, Helen and I decided we wanted to write an Oxford Companion of Indian Food. Because at that time, Oxford University Press, and this was the New York branch, was doing a series of encyclopedic work on different national cuisines. So we put together a big proposal outlining the purposes of the book, our qualifications, and all the topics we covered. These are called entries. So entries, and the titles were called headwords. So we had several hundred of these headwords. Again, there were Indian dishes, there were regional cuisines, there were people, and so on. And we had planned to write the entire book ourselves because at that time, and we're looking at maybe 20 years ago, there really weren't that many people that we actually knew who were writing this kind of encyclopedic writing, doing this kind of writing about Indian food. So our agent submitted the proposal. We eventually got a contract, but then at the last minute, Oxford decided to cancel the entire series, fire the editor, and we left us stranded. So we just put that on the back burner. Now, the second set of conferences I attended were the Tasting Indian Symposia that were organized by Sanju Malhotra and Suresh Bhattacharya here in Delhi. And these were held between 2016 and 2020. I think there were four of them. And these were just amazing events. I know that there were journalists coming from all over the world. There were leading chefs such as Asma Khan from the UK. Um, there were great meals, there were interesting sessions. And it was at these conferences I really met some great people and made some good friends, including Tanushree, Om, Soresh, Charmaine, and really other people who are here before today. Now, why I mentioned this is the plot kind of thickened. So around 8 years ago, during one of my visits to India, and by then I was going every year or two, I mean, once or twice a year, Soresh proposed the idea of writing an encyclopedia of Indian food, updating the I think, brilliant one written by K.T. Achaya many years earlier. So I said, Soresh, say no more. We already have a proposal on hand. This is the one that Helen and I had done many years ago. But so we took the proposal and we kind of rewrote it. We brought it up to date. But there was a difference this time, which was now, thanks to one, in part, the Tasting Indian Symposia, where we met a lot of people, and thanks to the way Indian food writing had evolved, we knew a lot of people who could contribute to this encyclopedia. It was no longer a case of Helen and I, and now Sardash and I just doing it ourselves. So, I mean, people in India had begun writing books about the various food, about regional cuisines, and there was really just so much expertise to draw upon. Now, Helen originally had family difficulties. She couldn't take part, but later, about midway through, she joined us. So what happened was Sordish, Helen, and I wrote about half the book ourselves, and the rest of it was written by people who really knew a lot about these subjects. So the final version, which was the Bloomsbury Handbook of Indian Cuisine, had entries on every Indian state, including places like Bihar and Madhya Pradesh, which really hadn't been that much written about it. We had entries on the major Indian cities, again by people who had lived there, about people who knew their cuisine. We had articles on the major Indian communities, and we had the issues. We had articles on famous chefs, on famous food writers, and on famous dishes like chicken 65 and eggs kajirel. And Sawdish did a lot of those, and I think they were really excellent. One of them, the best entries. So, so the project took 3 years from start to finish, and Bloomsbury, which was a very, I think, very prestigious publisher. I think they published Salman Rushdie, among other people. Um, we were happy to have them. And then Sawdish arranged for an Indian version, which appeared for about a year later here in India. So this is rather a convoluted story of the events that led up to the production of one book. And you can see how both luck and planning played a role in its creation. And it also shows how Indian food writing has really just undergone such a dramatic renaissance. And you know, we've seen so many good books lately on the publication of the cuisine of books on Indian cuisines. We have books on Delhi, Calcutta, Rampur, how Salma Hussein's works on Mughlai cuisine. We have other things. So, and I really think in India there's just an infinite potential for such books because the interest in food history really continues to grow. And I think every city, every state, every place in Delhi, really in India should have its own history. We can have books on sweets, and I think I'd love to see someone write a book on Indian breads because I just think there's just such a richness of material there. And so. So, and that's where I think again a role conference like this could play a role. And I think Tanushree is going to be publishing a book on dairy, which would just be such a wealth of information, and I really can't wait to see it. Now, Tanushree asked me about my new project, and I've just started this. And the book is tentatively called Curry and Beyond, A History of Indian Food in the United States. And this is amazingly the first book on this topic. And there's been at least half a dozen books written on the history of Chinese food in the United States. Um, and this is part of a broader topic that's always interests me, is the food of the Indian diaspora. And, you know, according to the United Nations, India has the world's largest diaspora population. A few years ago, it was estimated at 18 million Indians living outside their homeland. And wherever they went, Indians have left their mark in the cuisine. And I have another paper I've given a few times, which is how India, something to the effect that how India is the cuisine, as the country that's most transformed, most affected, transformed the world's cuisine. And of course, by India, I looking back thousands of years in history. So I'm talking about India as the entire subcontinent as it existed, probably under the Maurya Empire, since that's kind of, I think, a starting point. So, so I'm looking at Indians, and again, I'm talking very broadly. I really should say South Asians, but since I write about history, I do go back to maybe pre-independence India. So there's an estimated 4.5 million people of Indian origin in the United States, plus 100,000, I mean 500,000 Pakistanis, and about 200,000 Bangladeshi Americans. And of course, there's been a dramatic rise in Indian restaurants in the United States that range from street food establishments to Michelin star temples of cuisine. I think there's 4 Indian restaurants in the U.S. that have Michelin stars, including one we have in Chicago. And the final chapters of my book are going to be devoted to looking at the whole restaurant scene in the US, but I haven't really done the in-depth research yet on that, so I'm not going to say much about that now. So what I want to focus on is the early history of Indian food in the US, which is really quite interesting and has some surprises. And the first one is that the first thing I discovered is that South Asians were arrived in the United States as early as 1635. On the second ship that arrived in the Jamestown colony in Virginia, there were South Asians there. So they were really the first non-European immigrants to arrive in the United States. Now, and this second ship had one of its passengers was a South Asian man who was described in the ship's register as Tony, an East Indian. And I know I don't like that phrase, but that's how that's how people describe to East India to separate them from what were called Indian Indians, no, Asian, American Indians in the U.S. So he was part of the entourage of a wealthy merchant. English merchant. And the following decades saw the arrival of hundreds of South Asians, and they were called East Indian Indians in America to distinguish them from the local natives. And most of these were indentured, were servants actually, and they were brought by people who had made their money in India in the East India Company. And so they and what they wanted to do, they made their fortunes by not very nice means, to acquire land in the New World. And the more people that were in your household, the more land you could get. So it was in their interest to bring their servants along who had come from India and probably then brought to the New World. So throughout the 17th and 18th century, large estates had many Indian servants. You had dinner parties, and they would feature curries, chutneys, and other dishes that were popular among the host's aristocratic counterparts in Britain, because in Britain at that time, curries had begun to become the word curry, of course, being a generic term for pretty much any Indian dish with a gravy. Um, uh, so that they had become popular in America as well. And for example, and there were a lot of ties between the two sister colonies. And what, for example, George Washington had three Indian step grandchildren because his daughter had married John Law, who was one of these East India people. Elihu Yale, who founded Yale University, he had been one of the governors of Madras. I think he was actually fired for corruption, but he had too made a fortune there and came back to America. So there were a lot of ties going on. And in the early days, Indian food in America was mediated through the mother country, to go back to India. And it was really, dishes called curry were really kind of a mainstay of of Indian cuisine in America until well into the 20th century. And it was only really following the loosening of immigration laws in 1965 that curry more or less disappeared from menus. You see it occasionally, but not that often here. And food really began to reflect restaurant or trends in Indian food itself. So then you had the countries, restaurants like Gaylord's, Open Branches, and you had the popularity of so-called North Indian and so-called Mughal food. Now, actually, Indian immigration into America really remained quite small, and the 1900 census listed only about 22,000 people of Indian heritage who were here in the U.S., at least legally. There were students, there were religious leaders, there were a few businessmen, and they would be the ones who were here. But apart from that, immigrants came in two small groups. Now, the first between 1900 and 1910, more than 3,000 farm workers, and again, these probably wouldn't be listed in the official census, they were mainly Sikhs from the Punjab, came to California, where they became successful farmers. Some of them had come from Canada. Originally, they'd go into Canada because, of course, Canada was a fellow, I don't know what the word is, colony of UK, so it was easier to get there. But then anti-immigrant sentiment drove some of them down across the border into Washington and eventually into California. The Canadian government treated them very badly. And in fact, the British government really was not happy about these people going to the New World. in part later because they became kind of hotbeds of revolution thanks to the Qatar Party, which I'll mention a little bit later. Um, in 1917, in any case, the US government banned further immigration from Asia. So the people who were already here, they had more or less come, there was not really that many restrictions on Asian immigration officially until 1917. So when they banned immigration, they couldn't bring wives over. So many of these Sikhs in California, also in Arizona and Texas, married Mexican women. Now, Mexican were permitted to come legally because there was a shortage of agricultural workers, and they were also permitted to learn to own land. Because at some point, the American government banned the ownership of land by Asians, and this was included Chinese, Japanese, and South Asians. Eventually, there were 400 of these couples of Mexican, they were called Mexican Hindu couples. And I should say that the word Hindu became an official census category until I think 1940 that included Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims. The United States government just kind of put them all together. And I think this may have come from the old word Hindustan for India. I don't know where it came from. So these people developed a very interesting cuisine, which combined elements of Mexican and Punjabi food. They usually didn't put them together in the same dish, but they had a few restaurants, and they would serve things like Hindu pizza, Hindu enchilada. The women would make they called bread Indian bread roti. All breads were called roti, and of course, if you had Mexican food, you know that Mexican breads are very much like Indian chapati. They're the use of spices is another conversion. So it wasn't really a great cultural shift for these women to adapt to this style of cooking. I think the last restaurant probably closed about 20 years ago. But what's interesting is all throughout the Western US, you find elements of this Indian influence in so many restaurants. You have Indian pizzas. You have food trucks that serve kind of dishes that kind of combine these two. So I don't think it's a direct continuation, but it is interesting to see this. Now, the second group of early immigrants were Bengalis, and Bengalis from Muslim Bengalis mainly from what would today be Bangladesh. And the first group were these Muslim peddlers, and they began coming to the U.S. in the 1880s. And they didn't come, they came from the air, some from villages around Calcutta. And what they did is there was a great craze for Indian silks and Indian perfumes and things in the United States. So these peddlers would come. Originally, their plan was to come every year, sell their wares, and they were based in New Orleans. And then they would travel north and they'd go to places like Atlantic City, to the various tourist resorts of the East and the South. They would sell their wares, and then the idea was they would go back to Bengal and load up. But what happened is they eventually ended up settling down. Their base of operations was in New Orleans, and here some of them married African American women. And we don't really know what happened to them. A professor called Vivek Bald is really the ones who I'd say kind of unearthed their history. So they kind of just really vanished actually, and we don't really have any, I think, genetic or culinary traces of them today. But there was a much larger group of Bengalis who came, and they were the ones who jumped ship. Now, a lot of Indians were recruited by the British Merchant Navy to work, and they were called Lascars, and they were really treated badly. They were ill-treated, they were ill-treated, their food rations were terrible. So a lot of them, when they got to England, they they left the ships. They just left, and they settled in the docks around London, and that was really one community that started there. The same thing happened in New York, in Boston, and Philadelphia. Some of them were just abandoned there, but some of them actually just left of their own free will. So, and again, they were here illegally, and many of them married Puerto Rican and African American women. And they, especially in many of them lived in Harlem in New York. They opened butcher shops and restaurants. And I remember as a student at Columbia University, and this was ages ago, there were still a couple of these restaurants that they founded left. I think most of them being disappeared as the area got a lot more gentrified. But they did open some of the first restaurants in Harlem in the 1920s, and later some of them moved to Midtown Manhattan. And in the 1940s, there were several of these restaurants, some of which had links to these original people, and some of which were founded by other people who had come. And that was really the start, I think, of the Indian restaurant industry in the United States. Their menus again featured curries. They didn't have, North Indian, they didn't have Mughlai food. And the food, I think, was probably a bit more authentic than you found than you would find later. There was one fellow named Lahiri who was a dancer, and he opened a restaurant that became very popular. And he had things like a Bombay thali. He had a Bengali thali that had luchis, for example, which you hardly ever see in an Indian restaurant, at least not in Chicago. And he had some Bengali sweets. So it was kind of interesting to see these menus of these early restaurants. Um, I should also add that in the 1920s, some of these other seamen and other these Bengalis joined part of what's called the Great Migration as African Americans moved north in search of work during World War I. There were a lot of factories and steel mills, and this is something I'm looking into now. They moved to cities like Chicago and Detroit and Dearborn. They worked in the Ford factory. So I recently just hired a researcher to try to find more information about these people. Did they have their own restaurants? Is there any mention of grocery stores? So this is an area I really would like to learn more about, and because it's something that I think it's very interesting, and especially the ties with the African American communities, which they were driven partly by racism, because there was a lot of racism in those days. Another group that came were students. I think not that many. There were maybe 200 students a year who came. Many of them settled on the West Coast, Berkeley University and University of California. At other locations, there were some in Chicago. And this really became a hotbed of revolutionary activity. They had their own newspaper. They disseminated this, asking for independence from Britain, trying to stir up revolution. They didn't really get a very warm reception in India itself at that point. We're looking at the 1910s. And they stirred up so much trouble that the British government started, pressuring the American government to crack down on these students. And there was a lot of interest in the Sikh community among them. Many people were deported. There were laws depriving Indians of their citizenship, but that's a complicated matter and not really related to culinary history. But so. So really, things started to change in 1965 when immigration laws based on preference for Europe were abolished. Preference was based on professional status and family reunification. So in the years that followed 1965, 40,000 South Asians started entering every year, and the population continued to grow. And then, of course, in 1989, the H-1B visa was started, which allow employers to temporarily employ foreign workers in specialty jobs, especially in the computer industry. And the majority of these jobs have been held by Indians. Um, now, to go back to 1965, of course, the restaurants that were open then really reflected what was going on in India. That was the restaurant like Gaylord's and Quality, and the popularity of tandoori cuisine, of North Indian cuisine, and this so-called Mughlai cuisine. And then you also had restaurants serving South Indian vegetarian food. These also became popular. And you had Indian chains such as Saravan Bhavan and Woodlands opening outposts. Another source of vegetarian food were the Hindu temples that began being built in the 1980s, and many of these have their own canteens, which often serve South Indian vegetarian food and are really quite good. And So I think there was a growing interest for Indian food in the 1960s and the 1970s. One another reason was the counterculture's interest in Indian music, and popularized by Beatles and Ravi Shankar and other people. So, so looking at the present time, my hands-on experience really now is in Chicago. Um, in Chicago, oh, I'm sorry, are we finished? I can. The three, yeah, I'll just conclude shortly. The three major immigrant groups are we the ethnicity of Indians differs by city. So in New York City, you have a lot of Bangladeshis, a lot of Bengalis. In Texas, you have a large Indian Bengali community. In Chicago, our three main groups are people from Andhras, Kerala, people from Kerala, and Gujaratis. So besides the standard North Indian Mughlai restaurant, we also have smaller restaurants featuring the food of these groups. I think there's a growing interest in Kerala food. I think we have four restaurants serving it now, which I'm really excited about. And of course, we have Andien by Sujan Shadkar, which got a Michelin star. And we also have little joint serving taxi drivers, which are called dhabas, like in India. So we have a pretty broad range here. But I do have to go and investigate what's going on in other American cities, especially in Texas, especially on the West Coast. So maybe at some other point I can give a report on what's happening elsewhere. So that's just kind of a summary of what my work has been. I hope there's some interest to people. And I want to thank you again very much for inviting me. I really wish I could be there, but I really want to work on this book, so I didn't come this time. So thanks a lot, Tanushree and Om.
Thank you, Colleen, for the keynote. I think we can spend 5 minutes if anybody has any questions or anybody has any comments for Colleen. If not, thank you so much. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank you for your contributions as the jury of the ICA Food Writing Prize. Thank you, Colleen.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you.